My name is Gerald Howard. I'm a trustee on the board of this institution, and I want to welcome you all to this author circle event. It's really great to see people in person for this one, and not just on a computer screen. I think real life is trending upward. Let's hope that this trend continues. Although, just to contradict myself, I also want to welcome our viewers on the computer screens as this event is being live streamed on Zoom. And we're really delighted to have as our guest today, Janice Nimura, the author of this terrific, and there's a copy line here that publishers love, New York Times best-selling, the Doctors Blackwell, which is the dual biography of two sisters, Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell, who against long odds and really fiercely entrenched opposition managed to become some of the first fully credentialed physicians in pre-Civil War America. It's a complicated story. It's deeply researched, masterfully told, and one that has quite a lot of resonance for our medical situation today. By a happy harmonic convergence, Janice's editor at W.W. Norton, Elaine Mason, and her literary agent, Rob McQuilkin, are both Tuxedo Park people and are here in the audience. And I also want to thank Marie-Claude Wren for suggesting Janice Nimura as in her book for an author circle conversation. And I should say, by the way, if anyone here or out there has a suggestion along these lines, please pass it along to the library. There are no guarantees on this. Practical matters will intervene on occasion, but we have a good track record of attracting authors of very high quality to our classy library, and so we'll do our best. Welcome, Janice.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor and a privilege to be with you all.
I want to congratulate you on, among other things, the reviews and endorsements that take up about 7 or 8 pages in the front of the book. I'm pretty, as a publisher, former publisher myself, I'm a little jaded about these things, but that's like really, I have to say, it's like, whoa, very well published. Hi, Elaine. And I imagine that the book will have a really nice life in backlist and should be probably already being studied in the colleges and we may hope in medical schools.
I hope. I've definitely had some wonderful conversations with groups of physicians.
Try to speak up. Yeah, okay, we will. So how it's going to go, we'll talk for about 45 minutes of conversation. Then we'll have time for questions from the floor and maybe out in internet land. And then you can even buy a book. So let's start, Janice, with some basics. How did you come to practice the arduous occupation of the biographer, and how did the Blackwell sisters come to your attention?
Gosh, I came to biography because I love to write, but I don't have much of an imagination, so fiction was really never an option. My first book, Daughters of the Samurai, A Journey from East to West and Back, grew out of my personal history, marrying a guy from Japan in the back row, living in Tokyo for a few years, coming back and studying East Asian studies and falling in love with a story that I couldn't resist telling. It was a sort of a story that grabbed me and insisted that I tell it. I was sort of like the medium. That was so much fun with Elaine and Rob as well, that I just had to do it again. So then it became how to find a second story, which is harder than just falling in love the first time. I found this because I stumbled across, I think I may be the only person who met Emily Blackwell first. Elizabeth Blackwell is somebody that I think a lot of people encounter on the children's biography shelf, in a inspiring lives for girls kind of context. I had missed that bit because I was too busy reading Mary Poppins. I wasn't in the biography section as a kid. And I stumbled across Emily Blackwell as an icon of the gay 19th century. She had had a female partner, and she ended up in a book of lesbians and their contributions to the Victorian world. You can't spend any time with Emily Blackwell without meeting Elizabeth. And once I had met them, I couldn't believe that I had never met them. I couldn't believe that I had grown up in New York and gone to an all-girls, rather feminist school, and been the math science kid, and even gotten to college with the intention of studying medicine, and I had never heard of them. So that made me curious, and then I wanted to pursue that.
For the New Yorkers in the audience, there's no connection between the Blackwell sisters and Blackwell Island, which later became now Roosevelt Island. But I mean, that was my first impulse. So your book is it's a very crowded book. It's people with all sorts of significant figures like Horace Greeley, Florence Nightingale, Henry Ward Beecher, Lord Byron's widow, and even briefly Abraham Lincoln. But the real crowd is the Blackwell family. There's a lot of them, nine children, very large brood. They're clearly formed and certainly supported Elizabeth and Emily. Tell us about the Blackwell clan, how they came to America, their family dynamics and things like that.
Right, so the Blackwells, 8 out of the 9 of them were born in Bristol, England. They were the sons and daughters of Samuel Blackwell, who was a bit of a paradox. He was a man who had made his fortune in the sugar refining industry. Bristol was a sugar capital, and he spent all of his free time as an abolitionist. That for a second. He was a man who was an unorthodox thinker. Even as he was earning his fortune in the sugar industry, he was trying to think about how to fix the moral hygiene of the sugar industry. And the way to do that, he thought, was to figure out how to refine sugar from sugar beets, which could be grown in the north and not with enslaved labor on Caribbean plantations. So on the strength of that dream, he moved his family from Bristol, first to New York in 1838, where the 9th Blackwell, George Washington Blackwell, was born, and then all the way up
That's
to...
cute. Isn't that nice?
They called him Washi Blackwell. And then in 1838, they made it all the way out to Cincinnati, which at that point was basically the edge of civilization. And the idea was to find the space and opportunity to grow sugar beets and figure out how to refine them. He got them all the way out there in the summer of 1838 and dropped dead, leaving them with very little money. 9 siblings, 5 daughters who suddenly had a very clear sense that having a husband was no guarantee of security. None of the 5 daughters ever married. And all 9 of them had been educated to the same degree, even despite their sex differences. So that also was unorthodox. And so they became, the women became 2 doctors. Anna Blackwell, the eldest, was a journalist. Ellen Blackwell became a painter. The 5th daughter was Marion was more of the sort of center of the home and looked after mom. And then 2 of the brothers, Henry and Sam, married 2 of the most prominent feminists of the day, Lucy Stone and Antoinette Brown, a suffrage activist and the first woman in America to be ordained as a minister. They were sort of the first feminist husbands. So yes, there's a wonderful book called Those Extraordinary Blackwells, which is about all of them as a group. There was a lot. Plus, they all wrote to each other constantly.
Yeah, which you make excellent use of. 2 takeaways. One thing, sugar refineries apparently had a tendency to explode. I hope you don't live next to one. They probably fixed it by now, but that was one of the problems that the father had, that his refineries kept on imploding. And secondly, in the family, it certainly does seem like it's the women who are more successful than the men.
Well, right. So when Samuel, the patriarch, dies, the 3 eldest children and the only 3 children who are of age are girls. And they snap into action and found a school in their living room to kind of keep the family.
Yeah, when in doubt, found a school.
Found a school.
It seems like that is the family motto, really.
It was one thing that women could do to earn money right away. And I think as the boys in the family came of age after that, I think there was an unusual level of gratitude toward these elder sisters who had kind of kept the family afloat, so that those brothers ended up supporting the sisters in their unorthodox paths away from marriage.
Right. So the alpha girl in the Blackwell family is Elizabeth, and she's the center of your book. She's an admirable figure in her like fierce determination to become a woman doctor when that just seemed impossible. But she's complicated in lots of ways, not always likable, sometimes really arrogant, and far from the feminist pioneer that those children's biographies talk about, and that contemporary readers would expect. So tell us about Elizabeth in all her contradictions.
Yes. I mean, I think that's why she's easier to find on the children's shelf than on the adult shelf, because grown-up biographers might pick her up and get excited and then realize that she says things like, women are stupid, and think, maybe I don't really want to write about her. Elizabeth Blackwell was a massive contradiction. She was an idealist at a level that it's hard to grasp today, I think. She really believed that her life could be an example that would help humanity rise to a new level of enlightenment. She had read her Margaret Fuller, her Woman in the 19th Century. She really believed that she had a job to prove to the world that women could be anything they wanted to be. It was a matter of talent and toil and not sex. At the same time, she had a pretty dim view of everyone who wasn't a Blackwell, especially women. She didn't really like taking care of people. She wanted to heal humanity, sort of writ large. She also was definitely a soloist. She wasn't much of a team player. So even as she achieved the extraordinary medical degree as the first one, and the women's rights movement, the leaders of the women's rights movement reached out to her and said, join us. We want your glow to help us shine. And she said, no, I'm really not interested in collaborating. I really don't believe that your goal of putting votes for women as the top priority makes any sense, because shouldn't we enlighten women and make them aware of their own power before they give them a vote? Because if we just give them a vote now, they'll just vote the way their men tell them to. She was very much at odds with the progressive women around her, which made her say things that sort of
knock you back.
Mm-hmm,
Really, there are any number of places where,
right.
oh gosh,
right.
Sisterhood is not powerful.
Well, and a part of that was very current, dismayingly. I think that kind of female misogyny is something that's still all around us. That sort of, I clawed my way to get here. You better be worth my time if I'm going to spend any on you. I don't want you to undermine my achievement. I think there are plenty of women today who are still guilty of that.
I think it's historically pertinent too. It complicates your picture of what the 19th century was like and what the current of opinion were, and you could be two things at once. There's one line that just jumped out at me. This the essential Elizabeth Blackwell note. She says, "We must have patience with the age while we work to bring about a juster arrangement." I mean, I think she saw herself as a figure of destiny and not just a doctor.
Right.
But being a doctor was her route to that larger destiny. So the difficulties, but she said, okay, I want to be a doctor. So this is 1840 something or other, but finding some place that would accept her as a student was just, talk about a glass ceiling. This is more like a cast iron ceiling. So talk about how she went about it and how she managed to break through.
Right. So medicine, as you say, was a strategic choice. It wasn't that she was called to heal. It was that she could see that at this point in the 1840s, being a doctor was a matter of having a diploma from a medical school. So she thought, I am a very brilliant woman. If I can find myself a seat in a medical school and attend all the lectures and pass all the examinations, no one can argue that I'm not as qualified as any man to be a doctor, QED. The idea, though, of a woman seeking a spot in the medical school was outrageous to a degree that it's hard to grasp now. People either laughed at her or refused to talk to her.
There were no women doctors.
There were no women.
Period.
There were no women doctors, and there were no women in medical schools. Being a physician was outside the domestic sphere. It wasn't being a teacher or a nurse, so it wasn't an option for women. And at the same time, going to medical school entailed sitting in a room full of men studying the intimate intricacies of the human body. What kind of lady would do that? You must be either wicked or insane to want to do that. So she was really, a sheaf of rejections, even if she got that far.
You didn't take medical boards either. I mean, it wasn't like there was a test. You had to talk your way. She had to talk to people to get rejected.
Right, exactly. And then, the story of her acceptance is sort of the story of an accident. She sent a query to a tiny provincial medical school called Geneva Medical College in Geneva, New York, which is at the tip of Seneca Lake. It has since evolved into Hobart and William Smith colleges, if you're familiar. And she had the backing of a prominent Philadelphia physician with whom she had been studying privately, and he had endorsed her application. And the provincial faculty of this small provincial medical school was not quite bold enough to say flat no to a prestigious Philadelphia physician. So they punted the question to the students, a bunch of 100 rustic country boys. Medicine was what you went into if you weren't clever enough for the law or the ministry, and said, okay, boys, take a vote. If any one of you says that this woman shouldn't join us, we'll tell her no. They were chickening out of the decision. The boys immediately recognized that this was a great opportunity to make mischief. And apparently they had a class meeting that evening in which they bludgeoned into submission anyone who didn't think it was a good idea and returned a triumphant yes, she should come the next day, upon which they forgot about it. They assumed it was a prank. They thought it was a practical joke being played on them by a neighbor, by Syracuse. And forgot about it until Elizabeth Blackwell walked into the lecture hall.
Hello, boys.
Silence fell.
But as you described it, they were, for men, pretty well behaved and welcoming. And of course, she did well in her studies.
Well, I think you flip that around. She did so well that they quickly came to respect her.
Oh, okay.
I think it became clear pretty swiftly that she was operating at a level of intellectual firepower and determination that none of them could match.
Yeah.
And that if you wanted your notes to look good, you should probably sit next to her.
And the head of the school wasn't too bad a guy, again, given that he was
True.
encouraging.
He was encouraging. It's hard to tell from the sources. I think he was encouraging because he recognized that she was talented. And he was encouraging because this was a small provincial medical school, and the eclat that was connected to having a woman among them could bring them some publicity that he was kind of happy about.
So, because she's Elizabeth Blackwell, she does really well in her studies. And the fact of a woman studying in a medical college begins to attract a lot of attention in the press. She graduates cum laude or whatever, and then heads off to Philadelphia for a while, and then to London, and really for medical finishing school, you go to London and Edinburgh, which was a huge intellectual center, and especially to Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And so she's a doctor. She comes to New York and she opens an office and nobody comes, right? Money was a problem, right?
Nobody comes because, well, she assumed that hanging out a shingle would be instantly successful. And so did her professors assume that, because they thought, well, women will flock to you because women die because they are mortified to reveal their symptoms to a man. So this will be a wonderful opportunity for women to confide their gynecological illness to a fellow woman. Nobody shows up because the phrase female physician in 1851, when she gets back to New York, means a abortionist. It means someone like Madame Restel, the notorious Fifth Avenue abortionist, about whom Kate Manning has written a great novel called My Notorious Life. A female physician is someone who works on the wrong side of the law in the shadows, and is or not in the shadows, but in infamy. It's not the kind of person that nice ladies, matrons consult. So it's hard at first.
So jumping over a lot, but if the patients would come, I'll build some place for them to come. I mean, she decides to start an institution, and she puts together. She starts a place we call an infirmary or a dispensary that opens, and the building is still extant on Bleecker Street and Crosby, which I think is called. Well, tell me, it's called the infirmary.
The New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children. In its infancy, that's what this was.
How's that for salesmanship here? Oh, sure, I'd love to go there. Right? But anyway, it was a very big deal at the time. I mean, I think this would be a good place to talk about medicine in the 19th century. And frankly, another takeaway from your book is the most dangerous, if you are ill, the most dangerous thing you can do for yourself is to go to a doctor. Medicine was not really scientifically based.
Right. So 1840s, which is when Elizabeth got her medical degree in 1849, was sort of the high watermark, the beginning of the end of what was known as heroic medicine. There were almost no diagnostic tools for looking inside the body, and medicine was a matter of basically, if there was something wrong, make things come out, right? Make your patient vomit, give them an enema, make them sweat, bleed them, blister their skin so that you get laudable pus coming out. Whatever is bad.
I love that phrase.
It's pretty horrifying, and the only drugs that are useful that seem to create some kind of effect are opium or mercury. Basically, are the heavy hitters of the pharmacopoeia.
Yeah.
Right. Medicine does harm more than it does good, and a good doctor is often the man who makes something visible happen, because just letting nature take its course doesn't get you big fees from your patients. It was pretty hard for her.
Yeah. Well, welcome, Elizabeth.
Right.
But her practice, I think we should say, was exclusively for women.
Right.
There is no man that would ever
Be treated by a
subject
woman.
himself by a woman. That would have been humiliating. And so, but the women needed a woman touch or the understanding. So what?
The impetus to found the infirmary was several fold. First of all, if no nice matron from Washington Square wanted to consult a female physician, let's provide free care to poor women who really can't afford to be choosy. That's one way to get patients. Then you start an institution that's yours, so nobody can tell you, you know what, fresh air and cold water aren't how we do things around here. She knew instinctively that hygiene made more sense than opium and mercury. Having your own institution in which the wonderful phrase she used was to commit intelligent heresy. That appealed to her as well. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, well, she had many, and she a good self-publicist too, and she had strong connections with a lot of people of influence who. So this place got a lot of attention. Let's give some attention to her sister for a second.
Yeah. So
poor Emily.
Right.
Who needs the spotlight?
Well, right. I think if you've heard of either Blackwell, you've only heard of Elizabeth. Emily was sort of anointed by Elizabeth to follow her into medicine. Elizabeth said, "This is going to be hard. I want company. I don't really think much of other humans as much as I esteem my own siblings, so I choose you, Emily, as my next youngest and most brilliant sister." The interesting thing about Emily is that she really was drawn to science. She liked natural science. She was interested in the technology of medicine, of improving practice, of making women's health better. You would think that being the second Blackwell sister to attempt entry into medical school, she would have found it easier. You would be wrong. After Elizabeth's success, the men's medical colleges shut their doors even more firmly because it was horrifying that a woman had been so successful in medical school. And meanwhile, women's medical colleges had begun to open. So as long as they existed, it was much harder for a woman to find a place.
I want to stop there for a second. Yes, these colleges began to exist, but they were not high-end institutions. And who started these other colleges? How did they get started, given the prejudice against women?
I mean, Elizabeth Blackwell happened to be the first, but she wasn't the only woman who was directing herself toward medical study. It's what's the term for simultaneous invention of the same idea? There were women in Philadelphia,
Synchronicity or
something like that, who were moving in that direction as well. And sort of cells of progressive free thinking, often Quakers, who were willing to support a venture like that. And so small women's medical colleges had opened in Boston and in Philadelphia. The Blackwells had no respect for those institutions. They considered them mediocre. And Emily, I think, born of sibling rivalry a little bit, was not interested in getting a degree that was lesser than the one her sister had won. So even though Geneva Medical College rejected her, she went to Rush in Chicago.
Which was more prestigious. Larger, better?
Was larger, better, was very new at the time. She had a wonderful year there with an excellent mentor, who then went on sabbatical, at which point the trustees said, please don't come back. We really don't want to give you a degree after all. So after one of the 2 years of medical school, then, because medical school was 2 terms, she had to find a second school. So she went to Cleveland Medical College, which has since evolved into Case Western, and got her degree there. But I think all along, she was much more turned on by the field, by the practice, by the information and the intellectual challenge than Elizabeth had been.
I mean, what makes them such an interesting pair of sisters are, not just the similarities, but the differences. Because Elizabeth is somebody who's more interested in changing the world and making sure that people knew that she was doing it. Whereas Emily is a real doctor. She's quite a skilled surgeon, right? And an administrator too.
That's right. That's right.
So she literally almost in many ways follows in her sister's footsteps. After she's gets her degree from Rush, she heads off to England and France. The particular institution that they both studied in that was most probably important to them was this huge hospital in Paris, La Maternité, for obvious reasons, but just I mean, their practice was OBGYN, right? Largely, or
naturally, but not exclusively. I mean, they were treating women, and women seek a doctor for childbirth issues, for female cancers, for complications from childbirth. So it went there, but it wasn't exclusively that. I think they both did study at La Maternité in Paris. Elizabeth's study there, I think, coincided with a catastrophe in her life that channeled her in a slightly different direction from Emily. So backing up for a second, a hospital in the 1840s was not, we think of a hospital as a place to go and heal. A hospital in the 1840s was a place to go if you had nowhere else to go. If you had any resources, the doctor came to you. If you were going to a hospital, you were destitute. And so a hospital was a public health issue. It was where poverty and health intersected. Elizabeth found her way first to La Maternité because the rest of the medical education in Paris was closed to her because she refused to dress as a man. She refused to pretend to be a man. The whole point was to prove what a woman could do. So La Maternité, which was a training hospital for young women who wanted to be midwives, was the only place that she could go and get experience. While she was there, she had a crisis. She contracted an infection from an infected
Oh,
patient.
yes, her eye infection.
Whereby she lost one of her eyes, which she wore a glass eye for the rest of her life. It directed her in the direction she was already going, which was toward public health, toward the female physician as a teacher armed with science, somebody who was thinking about hygiene and public health and lecturing and writing and thinking.
She wrote a number of quite significant and popular books about health.
Right.
She would be on television
Right.
now today. She'd be Sanjay Gupta.
Something like that.
I didn't mean that as a laugh line. I mean, yeah.
No, it's true.
She wouldn't be
It's very
Dr.
true.
Oz.
She would be a mouthpiece. She would be a medical mouthpiece. Emily was really interested, and sorry, by virtue of only having one eye, surgery was closed to her. There were certain parts of practice that were just not an option anymore. So she went in the direction that she would have gone anyway. She just went there faster. Emily was very fascinated by surgery. She went to Edinburgh to study as well with a very prominent British physician called James Young Simpson, who taught her about gynecology at the highest level. He was a pioneer of the pelvic exam. He had figured out the anesthetic properties of chloroform. He was teaching her at a very high level, and she became someone who was interested in how surgical and medical techniques could make women's lives better, not just as a public health speaker, but as a practitioner, case by case. I think Emily at one point says, if she had her druthers, she would just put on men's clothing and work as a doctor and not have all of this constant static about being a woman in medicine. She just wanted to practice medicine. She didn't want to make a point.
One of the interesting footnotes of your book is that there was a woman doctor before Elizabeth Blackwell, but it was a woman who spent her entire life dressed as a man, right?
Oh, Mary Walker. Right.
Yeah, there's the only way to do it.
Oh, sorry, not Mary Walker. James Barrett.
Yeah.
So this is another great story, and there was a wonderful novel about her published last year called The Paved Doctor. There was an Irish woman named Miranda Barry who, as she came of age, disguised herself as a man and lived as a man for the rest of her life and became a military surgeon in the British Army. Totally successful. No one knew she was a she until she died and her body was laid out. That was really the first woman doctor, but no one knew that she was a woman.
So one of the bold-faced names in your book is Florence Nightingale, and Elizabeth Blackwell and Florence Nightingale had a fair amount to do with each other. You know, the pioneer of nursing as a profession and all that. They would seem to be, from a distance, to be natural allies. It really wasn't the case, and tell us why. What did they disagree about?
They started as allies. They started as ecstatic acquaintances. When Elizabeth was finished in Paris, she went on to study more in London, and mutual friends introduced her to this young woman named Florence Nightingale, who was not a global celebrity at the time. It was 1851. The Crimean War was far in the future. She hadn't done anything noteworthy yet. Her family really wanted her to settle down and get married. She was a wealthy girl with ideas about what women could do in public health that were fairly outrageous to her circle. Here comes Elizabeth Blackwell, who has a medical degree, who has forgotten about the idea of marriage years in the past, who has left her family in America and is roving around Europe getting experience. Elizabeth Blackwell is proof that what Florence Nightingale dreams of is possible. And I like to think that that encounter was something of a catalyst for Florence Nightingale's career. And they have this ecstatic, immediate friendship where they spend hours walking and talking about hospital administration, and hygiene, and all those sexy subjects that young girls talk about. And then they come to a basic misalignment, which is that Florence Nightingale thinks that the role of women in health is as nurses. And Elizabeth has staked her life on proving that they can be doctors. And so they are in touch forever through their lives and always sort of in tension. The New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children was founded on May 12th, 1857. May 12th is Florence Nightingale's birthday. And the newspapers that were covering the opening of the infirmary mentioned that it was Florence Nightingale's birthday. Even though Florence Nightingale had nothing to do with the founding of the infirmary, there was always a tinge of envy on Elizabeth's part that Florence Nightingale had become a global celebrity. And Elizabeth Blackwell, who had sort of set out to become a global celebrity, never quite achieved that level of acclaim, largely because the way she had the mission she had chosen was horrifying to a lot of people, whereas nursing was palatable. You could talk about Florence Nightingale in polite company. You couldn't really talk about Elizabeth Blackwell in a Fifth Avenue dining room because it was a little outrageous.
So, in a way, the career of the Blackwell sisters goes in plateaus. In a way, I mean, but in terms of the upward, the New York Infirmary eventually, I think it moves around, but they start a hospital and a medical college for women. One of the things that really struck me was how scathing Elizabeth Blackwell is towards the other women's medical colleges, probably with good reason, but maybe you could put it more diplomatically, which she didn't.
She didn't.
But anyway, they build this institution, which pioneering and high profile and all that. Emily, who really likes doctoring and isn't too bad at running an institution, takes it over, and Elizabeth heads on. Where do they go from there?
Right.
This is after the Civil War.
Yep, after the Civil War. And the opening of the college, it's true, they were rather dismissive toward women's medical colleges. They never intended for women to study medicine separately from men. They figured their own examples would lead the men's medical colleges to admit women, but that didn't happen. And the women's medical colleges were turning out graduates who were mediocre. The Blackwell sisters knew this because those graduates were coming to their infirmary to get practical training. They didn't know much. So they changed their minds in the end about women's medical education. Okay, if the men are not going to admit them, we are going to create our own women's medical college, and it's going to be better than the men's colleges. So it's 3 years instead of 2. It's progressive instead of repetitive. It includes tuition at the bedside, not just lectures and dissection. It actually looks forward to a lot of the innovations in medical education that would come in the 20th century. And I lost the thread of your original question.
Well, just what happens then is sort of my.
Oh, right. So once the medical college is founded, it opens in 1869. In 1870, and I think with some relief, the sisters part ways, and they spend the last 40 years of their lives on different continents. Elizabeth goes back to England, where she always wanted to return. She never considered herself American. She was always a little bit of an old world snob. Goes back to England and pursues public health and moral reform as she wanted to. Does more writing and speaking and doctoring. Emily remains in New York and finally alone, single-handedly runs the college and the infirmary herself for the next 40 years, basically sustaining her sister's legacy to the detriment of her own, because
that's the way the family works.
Elizabeth's name remains sort of on the masthead of these institutions, even though she hasn't been there. She does it very well, and it's interesting because I think their careers couldn't have happened without each other. But that parting, you do get a sense of them sort of heaving a sigh and going in the directions that they wanted to go without having to be yoked together anymore.
The institution lasted a good long time, and different. It morphed into just say what it turned into.
So the infirmary, which shortened its name to the New York Infirmary for Women and Children, that was the indigent part, moved around. It was on Livingston Place, and eventually it lasted for 100 years. It became part of NYU downtown. Now it's part of Weill Cornell Downtown Hospital. The DNA of the institution is still alive. The college was shut down in 1899, very intentionally by Emily. 1899 happened to be the year that Cornell and Johns Hopkins admitted women to the medical school. And she said, okay, our purpose here as a women's medical college is finished. We don't need to exist anymore because we were holding the door open, and now men have let that swing wider, and men and women can join the men now. And so we don't need to have a women's medical college anymore. She shut it down. But the infirmary, it persisted in a standalone form until the 1980s, and the DNA is still there.
That's a pretty good run for, so can you sum up in some way their achievement and their legacy? I mean, it's obviously good that I think you cited at the end that something like 35% of the new physicians in the United States are women now, or something.
Well, more than 50% of medical students are women.
Really?
Unfortunately, far less than 50% of department heads and medical center directors are women. So there's a disconnect.
What a surprise!
that we need to fix.
Yeah, but it just what did they achieve? What did they achieve everything they wanted to? Just give us the closing statement, and then we'll turn it over to questions.
I think they did achieve what they wanted to. I think Emily ended up being the more satisfied sister, because I think Elizabeth achieved what she wanted. She proved the point that she wanted to prove. She founded the institutions she wanted to found. But I think her original goal had to do with being, with recognition, with legacy, with reputation, with being celebrated in sort of the way Florence Nightingale was celebrated. And that didn't quite happen the way she expected it to. When she moved back to England, she thought she would become kind of a mentor to the rising cohort of female physicians there. They sort of said, thanks, but no thanks, and kept her at arm's length. And that, I think, was surprising and dismaying.
And there were other kind of well-known, famous women doctors who came along. There's one woman by the name of Garrett, and some of the attention was split into.
Right, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was the first British woman to get a medical degree. These were women who, and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was inspired initially by Elizabeth Blackwell. So was Mary Putnam Jacobi, another very famous female physician. They were the people who were just behind Elizabeth Blackwell were both better at collaborating, I think, and also more drawn to medicine as a subject. There's a wonderful letter from Mary Putnam Jacobi to Elizabeth Blackwell later, after she has moved back to England, saying, you were the one who imagined that we could do this. You had the ideal that we could be led toward. You left us to do the practical work. And that really kind of summed it up. Elizabeth Blackwell operated on a plane of idealism alone that left her, I think, somewhat lonely and unfulfilled at the end of her life. But without her example, these other women might not have achieved what they did.
So I think it'd be a good time to throw this up into question. Meanwhile, you have a little doodad.
I left it in my bag.
There's a souvenir from the 19th century that.
Yeah, no, I brought some show and tell, which I of course forgot to bring up here. Thank you.
But do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, sir.
During the period after 1835, the Jacksonian era, certifications were not required just to hang any shingle up.
Mm-hmm.
So why did they pursue such an arduous path? They could have taken a midwife's course and just gone into practice.
The point that Elizabeth Blackwell wanted to make was a woman can do whatever a man can do. And at this moment, that kind of wild west of medical practice was shifting toward you need a diploma from a medical school, because increasingly there were medical schools in the United States. They were all fairly young, but they were all becoming sort of the bottlenecks for medical careers. This convergence made it possible for her to say, okay, I'm going to go to a medical school and I'm going to get that sheepskin. And once I have it, no man can say, I didn't do what I was supposed to do to be a doctor. That was the kind of strategy. So, and she didn't go into it because she wanted to take care of people medically. She did it strategically to make a point about a woman being able to do what a man could do.
Was Hahnemann Medical School still there?
I'm sorry?
Was Hahnemann in Philadelphia still available, or that at that time?
I don't believe so. I don't know.
Yes.
Coming from her religious background, it's kind of surprising that she's so self-aggrandizing, that she really is very self-centered. I mean, Emily is not, and many of the sisters weren't like her. So, and I didn't get the feeling that from your novel that the brothers were like that. So,
Yeah,
where did that?
there's two things going on. One is that she's got some Calvinist input in her early life that makes her feel like one of the elect. She definitely thinks of herself as one of God's chosen, and that she has to live up to that. Part of it, though, isn't religious upbringing. It's just Elizabeth Blackwell being a very big ego. There are parts in the sources where she is writing in her journal or in a letter where she actually starts to sound like she considers God one of her colleagues. Like, me and God, we're going to make this happen. It kind of makes your eyes pop a little bit to read that, but that really was her personality. And on the one hand, it's a little off-putting, and on the other hand, it's what it took to do something that was that outrageous. So
It's a kind of a failed American studies student. One of the things that struck me was, I mean, she became a doctor because the transcendentalists told her nature.
know thyself.
Yeah, she was a Unitarian to the max. She was.
She didn't really fit
She
into
was on a
anything.
mission to fix the universe, really.
Right. I think in the end, she took input from a lot of different creeds, and in the end, she was sort of a religion of one.
Well, isn't that what Emerson told you you're supposed to be?
Right.
So show us your
Oh, right.
your,
So
your
this
instrument. This is great. This is
Just in the context, this is not baked goods. In the context of heroic medicine and the very paltry tools for peering inside the human body, this is a portable monaural stethoscope. So stethoscopes in the 1840s would not have been this; they would have been this. So this is a portable version. It folds. You screw it together like this. And then this part goes on the patient, and this part goes in your ear. And you can't hear a damn thing. It's interesting because you watch Elizabeth in letters and in journals talking about learning auscultation. Auscultation is taking a pulse. And you think, well, what do you have to learn? You put the stethoscope, I have my Fisher Price stethoscope in my toy box at home. What's the big deal? This thing is hard to use. So, and this was all they had, except for taking a pulse from the wrist. But as far as listening to the heart, this is what you had. This was a wonderful Christmas gift from my husband this year, and it really kind of brought home just how blind and deaf the diagnostician was until very recently. So people would like to take a look. I'll show it around later.
yes, sir.
This is more or less a non sequitur, but as a one-time leader of society pages, a very eminent beneficiary of debutante ball was the New York Infirmary. Did she, the Blackwells have anything to do with that?
Wait, come again?
There was a debutante ball for the benefit of the New York Infirmary.
What decade would this have been?
When I was younger.
Oh, okay.
1980s.
My familiarity with the workings of the infirmary ends with the Blackwells, who died in 1910. I'm sure that they did get very savvy about fundraising down the road.
We obviously linked up with the rich.
Well, from the start. Although in the early years of in the late 1850s and 60s, when they were getting the hospital and the college off the ground, the rich that they were linking up with generally tended to be Quakers, free thinkers, real progressives, not necessarily the social elite. And in fact, that was a source of frustration to Elizabeth, because I think she really wished that somebody would put her at the head of a committee for a debutante ball. That was the crowd that she wished would embrace her, and they didn't really until later.
Yes.
That's actually where I was going, so I don't think it's a non sequitur. Is because she had this vision and wanted to be legendary, was she good at fundraising? Where did all this money come from to initiate? I have not read it.
Yeah, no, she hated fundraising because she was not a glad hander. Neither of the sisters was particularly good at small talk. Elizabeth, spectacularly so. However, she knew that she understood the politics of success in this way. So she made sure that she had a strong connection to Horace Greeley and the publicity that the New York Tribune could provide. She was a child. She had known the Beecher family from childhood days in Cincinnati. So Henry Ward Beecher, who at that point was probably the most famous man in New York, became a real ally, gave the keynote at the opening of the infirmary. Good PR.
It's really, I published a biography of Henry Ward Beecher, so I know something about this. Talk about a gift. I mean, Henry Ward Beecher, the biography that I published was called The Most Famous Man in America.
It's a wonderful book.
That was not an overstatement. There were, his church was in Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights, and so many people would come across from Manhattan to see him on Sunday that they would call the ferry Beecher boats.
Yeah.
So that's an astonishing publicity coup to have Henry Ward Beecher give the opening statement.
Right. So, I mean, the answer is she was good at it. She hated it. She didn't enjoy it. The Blackwell sisters called it push. They hated having to push all the time to get the support that they needed, but they knew that they couldn't do what they were doing without it.
Did any of the family money come into it?
There wasn't any family money. The brothers
had done well.
The brothers did support them, and I think unusually so. I think the brothers were very grateful that the older sisters had kind of rescued the family in their time of need when the father died. And there was some family money in England as well. There were some cousins who were more successful than the American Blackwells. So there was a little bit of support there, but most of it came from names like Greeley and Beecher and
She got
Sedgwick and
£1,000, which was a lot of money from some countess, right?
Yes.
Yeah, tell us.
There was a lot of traveling in England and kind of promoting the cause, and there was a countess, Madame de Noailles, who took a liking to Elizabeth and wanted to set her up. Elizabeth and she were not really connecting on any intellectual level, but Elizabeth was savvy enough to bring home some
Yeah,
funds.
£1,000 was a lot in 1860.
Right.
Yeah, Marie.
I just want to emphasize, you can't emphasize enough the importance of the legacy of the Blackwell sisters. My father's sister went to medical school, one of those inferior Quaker schools, the Medical College of Philadelphia. And when she looked for an internship and a residency, she kept getting letters. We can't take you. We don't have a bathroom for women doctors. And the New York Infirmary for Women and Children, that's the only place where she could get a residency and an internship. That's where she trained in the 1930s. So there's the difficulty of women doctors making the goal that went over for a long time. And the Blackwell sisters really facilitated future generations of women doctors. Very, very important.
So one more question? Yes, yes.
It's sort of two parts.
Okay.
So earlier, the earlier question, we were talking about Elizabeth and that she just had this massive ego. And I was, just for the record, I love this book. I just felt immersed in that. I found myself thinking about them when I wasn't reading it. But I thought of her more as the to whom much is given, much is expected. Like that was sort of her perspective. She didn't really strike me as, I mean, yes, she was driven by this belief that she could do something which we could define as egotistical, but it seemed more to me like she just felt like she was sort of born with this like ability to do it. So she had to fulfill it because it was bestowed upon her, even if that is a self-aggrandizing thought. It would seem like it came even more from her parents and like how she grew up, and that she was, like I said, it was expected of her, so she did it, right? It
Yeah.
didn't seem ego-driven.
Yeah, I guess I make a slight distinction between having a strong ego and being an egotist. I
Yeah.
think she had
Okay.
a real sense of self, that she had a power within her that she needed to use to raise humanity, that was possible for
Yeah.
someone like her. I think that's we're saying the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was just gonna say, so this is more about you and like the way you managed to, I'm sure you just had so much more information that you put in here. It's just what it would take to write a biography like this. You would have just, but so there's a line in the war chapter where like Emily says, the government has given the sticks a semi-official recognition as meddler general. And then you say, oh, actually, that's what Elizabeth says. Emily wrote something more polite. And then
They
Elizabeth
didn't like
says,
Dorothea Dix.
yeah, Elizabeth says, a showy false thing has more success than an unpretending truth, and it is very difficult to make truth pretentious. It does not puff up nearly as readily as falsehood. So it's difficult to read that in a book published in 2021 and not think about, whatever it's called, misinformation, right? So I was just wondering, when you were like, do you think that like sort of the current vibe, for lack of a better word, like influenced some of what information you chose to?
Oh gosh.
I mean, it's hard to answer that question because it might have been not necessarily on a conscious level, but and are you her editor? Yeah. So just the way y'all worked together. I mean, it's just interesting when I read that. I mean, I marked it, so I was like, it's really fascinating. Like just that more things change than when they stay the same. And she was so mad about like people are just making shit up, making stuff up, and it's making them successful, right? And that's what's happening now. People make stuff up and nobody's bothering to parse the truth, right? So it was just really an interesting thing. So I was kind of curious about the way you decided. I guess my grander question is just how you decided what to share in the book, considering how much.
Right.
the volume
That's
of
a very broad
I
question.
know. I'm sorry. It's a big question.
No, it's great. Well, the first part of it is definitely this book felt like this story felt like an important story for this moment. Not just because all we do is talk about public health these days, but because it came out the night before Kamala Harris was inaugurated. There was a sense of we need to get away from the idea that female heroes have to be adorable, that female heroes have to be likable. Why can't we worship women who aren't adorable? We need to get away from that. There was something else I wanted to say that you just reminded me of. Leaving things out and putting things in. The best advice I ever got about how to do biography was at a bio conference. It's just leave out all the boring stuff. Which is essentially, if I have any process, that's my process. I'm sort of a magpie. I read and read and read, and every time there's something shiny or sticky, I take it and put it in a bag. And then when I've got a bag full of shiny, sticky stuff, I put it all out on a table and see what story those bits tell, because I have the attention span of a gnat. And if I can't hold my own attention, I'm going to lose the thread. So yes, there's lots of stuff. I always get questions about how do they pay for everything? I guess I didn't write enough about finance in the book because I don't find it all that interesting. I'd much rather talk about how people are feeling than where the money is coming from, which is a flaw.
How did you do your research?
Just reading thousands and thousands of letters, mostly. The beauty of the 9 Blackwell siblings is that they all drove each other a little nuts, and also were very closely bonded to each other. So they constantly were leaving and writing to each other. So every moment along the way had multiple perspectives.
And where
were you?
There's a huge pile of Blackwell material at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, and then another huge pile at the Library of Congress, and then a lot of
You were
small-
at the Radcliffe Institute for to work.
I was up there to do research. I
Yeah.
was not a fellow there. Yeah, I was
Right.
there to do research.
And
And it's all digitized. So
is it really digital? It's online and
all this
and
Schlesinger
searchable?
material is digital and
That's
you can look
incredible.
into it. The Library of Congress stuff is cool because they have a crowdsourced transcribing project going on. So if you want to be a citizen transcriber, you can go on there and they'll give you Blackwell materials that haven't been transcribed yet, and you can help.
There you go, folks. Okay, you have extra time on your hands? Transcribe a Blackwell letter. Well, our time is pretty much up. I think thanks so much for doing this.